Carefully selected native plant species are key components in some kinds of green infrastructure installations. Many of these plants are adapted to tolerate fluctuating water levels and to allow water to more effectively infiltrate the soil. And because these attractive plants are native to the region, they are adapted to cold winters and hot summers and can thrive without a lot of special attention. They will, however, have to compete with weeds. Weeds can disrupt the function and spoil the appearance of green infrastructure, so removing these weeds is one of the most important maintenance tasks associated with green infrastructure. There are many different kinds of weeds, and trying to identify all of them may seem overwhelming, but learning to identify just a small selection of the most common ones can help you tackle most green infrastructure weed control. Different people may define weeds differently, depending on what they are trying to achieve on the property. Someone who is trying to attract butterflies, for example, may welcome certain flowers that might be considered weeds by a vegetable gardener. For ecologists and other natural resource specialists, their definition of a weed is connected to whether the plant is native or non-native. Species that are native to a region are usually ones that have been present there for hundreds of years. They support more pollinators and are key components to the ecological health of the habitat. Non-native plants are those that originated far away in another part of the world and were brought to our area by human activity. Non-native species that are aggressive and outcompete native species are called invasive species. Green infrastructure typically utilizes native plants, so non-native plants, especially those that spread aggressively, are usually considered weeds for the purpose of green infrastructure maintenance. There are some native species that are not ideal in green infrastructure installations. Plants like poison ivy and ragweed are typically removed from green infrastructure. In most cases, you don't need to be a trained botanist to distinguish the desired species from the weeds. But in cases where two plants have a similar appearance, it is helpful to know some basic plant terms. These plants both have spikes of purple flowers, but one is the native blue lobelia and the other is the invasive purple loosestrife. When both are in bloom, they can easily be distinguished by their flower shape. Purple loosestrife has 5 or 6 petals that are all similar, coming out of a central point like spokes on a wheel. It's the typical shape that comes to mind when we think of flowers. That's why some plant books refer to these simply as regular flowers. Regular flowers may have just a few petals, or they may have so many that they're hard to count. When we look closely at blue lobelia, we see that instead of having petals that are all similar, arranged in a circle, it has an irregular flower. Sometimes irregular flowers look like tubes and might appear to have an upper and lower lip. In addition to these two flower types, there are differences in how the flowers are arranged on the plant. They may be in an umbrella-like shape, called an umbel. They may be in spikes. They may be on multiple branches from the main stem, arranged in what's called a panicle. Most plants only have a flower for a small part of the season. For the rest of the year, you may have to look at other features, like leaf shape and leaf arrangement. In some cases, small details about the leaves will help you distinguish one species from another. Are the leaves toothed, or do they have a smooth edge? Are they lobed or unlobed? Is the divided leaf made of many small leaflets, or is it simple leaved? Leaf arrangement is another characteristic that can help you distinguish one plant from another. Some plants have their leaves arranged alternately on a stem. As you look down the length of the stem, you'll see a leaf on one side, then further down the stem you'll see a leaf arranged on the other side. Other species will show opposite arrangement, in which there is a leaf on one side and another directly opposite to that one on the stem, so that there are pairs of leaves down the length of the stem. Some plants have multiple leaves in a whorl around the stem, and others may only have leaves at the base. In addition to these flowering plants, often known as broadleaf plants, green infrastructure will include different species of sedges and grasses. Sedges have long, thin leaves, so they can easily be mistaken for grasses by those unfamiliar with them. Both sedges and grasses can play an important role in green infrastructure, but there are also some species of sedges and grasses that are weeds. Grasses have round, hollow stems, while sedges have triangular stems. Grasses often have more delicate or feathery-looking seed heads, while the seed heads of sedges tend to be more stout and spiky. The specific characteristics that distinguish different species may be very small. It may be the way the leaf attaches to the stem, or the shape of the seed cover. But with practice and experience, you can quickly learn to recognize these species by their overall appearance, their height, the general look of their seed head, and other features. The task of identifying plants may seem overwhelming, but there are numerous field guides and websites to help. There are even some apps that can help identify plants for you. By starting with a short list of common weeds in the Midwest, you can be well on your way to identifying most of the plants you'll need to remove. Common reed, Phragmites australis, is one of the most aggressive invasive species in our region. Often referred to as just Phragmites, this tall grass can quickly dominate areas that have saturated soils. Phragmites can be over 10 feet tall, with a feathery plume that develops in late summer. Its leaves are alternate, and they clasp the stem tightly at their base. Removing Phragmites often involves a combination of methods that not only remove the above-ground portions of the plant, but also kill the underground rhizomes. An area covered in Phragmites can expand 30 feet a year as these rhizomes spread underground. So cutting or pulling Phragmites will not be effective methods if they are not followed by an herbicide treatment that kills these rhizomes. In dense stands where Phragmites is dominant, it is best to cut the plant in late summer when it's flowering. Then immediately treat with herbicide. Make sure you select the appropriate herbicide and follow the guidelines on the label. Herbicide formulated for use in wet areas such as rodeo is often the best choice because of the habitat where Phragmites grows. Make sure your spraying equipment is in correct working order and that your nozzle is adjusted properly so that the herbicide is hitting its target and not drifting in the wind. Hand wicking may be a better option when there are other species in the area that you want to protect. Hand wicking allows more targeted application. It involves wearing a protective glove that can keep the herbicide from contacting your hand, covered with an absorbent glove that can be saturated with the herbicide so that you can use your hand to wipe the herbicide onto the plant. Reed canary grass is another invasive grass. It is typically found in wet areas and is usually one of the first grasses to start sprouting in the spring. It can grow up to 6 feet tall. It has large, thin ligules that help distinguish it from other similar grasses. Like Phragmites, reed canary grass spreads primarily through underground rhizomes, so pulling or cutting alone is usually ineffective if not followed by the appropriate herbicide treatment. Purple loosestrife may be an attractive plant when it's flowering, but this non-native species is aggressive and can become a big problem in green infrastructure. Small stands of purple loosestrife can be pulled by hand. Larger stands may require an herbicide application. A single purple loosestrife plant can produce more than 2 million seeds, so if the plant is not treated before it flowers and produces seed, the plant can return in huge numbers the following year. Phragmites, reed canary grass, and purple loosestrife are more likely to be problems in larger green infrastructure projects. In rain gardens and other smaller green infrastructure installations, there are other weeds that you're more likely to encounter. Some of the common weeds that show up in these smaller areas may be the same ones that show up in yards and gardens. In fact, the flowers and bushes that people purchase from garden stores to plant around their homes typically aren't native, and neither are the most common yard weeds. This generally means that if you see something growing in green infrastructure that you've also seen growing in your yard, it probably shouldn't be growing in the green infrastructure. Be on the lookout for weeds like mugwort, dandelions, Queen Anne's lace, and some species of thistle. When these species are scattered in small amounts throughout the area, they may be hand-pulled. Thistles may require thick leather gloves to protect your hands. In areas where there are larger numbers of these species, carefully applied herbicide may be more appropriate. There are also some problematic vines, such as field bindweed and climbing buckwheat. Whether they are native or not, vines are not usually planted in green infrastructure because they tend to smother the more desirable species. These vines can be hand-pulled early in the season when they are still relatively easy to pull. Make sure you are able to distinguish them from poison ivy. To minimize your contact with poison ivy and ensure your safety, it is best treated with herbicide. This is just a sample of the many weeds that can cause problems in green infrastructure. With a little experience, you may be surprised at how quickly you can start to recognize the most common ones. Once they're identified in green infrastructure, it's important to treat them aggressively before they can get established and dominate the landscape. Green infrastructure, like traditional gray infrastructure, requires a maintenance plan. To keep green infrastructure looking and functioning as intended, the maintenance plan should utilize crews that can successfully identify and remove these weeds, creating beautiful landscapes that enhance cities and neighborhoods.